So giants in antiquity. What's up with that? Well, this particular documentary wants to talk about giants, quote unquote, in Sardinia, and it's trying to tie it to the story of the Nephilim in the Bible, and it's building up a hell of a stack of cards that's not hard to knock down. I'm not really going to bother with that exactly. Instead, I'm going to see if I can talk about a broader discussion of the variation of human size in antiquity, or before antiquity. Nowadays, we're genetically all mixed up. There's been a lot of genetic drift from just about all over the place. You're going to have a hard time finding much of anybody that doesn't have ancestry, near ancestry from pretty much all over the world. If you pick a Navajo Indian from, North America, chances are that you'll find, ancestry from Africa, from Europe. You pick a random Chinese person, they've got ancestry from the Middle East. We're all mixed up, right? So, but we're also several centuries into a reality where large-scale transportation across huge distances is very easy, where migration to anywhere in the world is feasible for anybody, and any sort of genetic bottlenecks that may have once existed, where any kind of isolated populations no longer exist. Was that true, 3,000 years ago? Perhaps not absolutely, but certainly much more so. So you would have significant barriers, such as the Sahara Desert or the Himalayan mountains, or the Alps even, that might not have completely stopped gene flow, but would have severely restricted it. So when we start talking about giants, we need to be a little bit careful about what that actually means. And a part of that means asking the question of just how tall it was that people in areas like the Middle East actually were. I have a low battery, so I'm going to swap this, and I'll be back in a second. Now, because my last couple of videos were about aliens, I think the first thing we need to do is ask the question, are aliens and giants the same thing? Well, if you're talking about the Nephilim in the Bible, maybe it might seem like they are. In other stories about giants, they're not the same, and in other stories about aliens, they're not giants. So, it seems to be that perhaps these are two different myths that manage to fuse in certain areas like the Near East. It's certainly not uncommon for myths to fuse. There's the example of the Egyptian Amun-Ra, where you had the two gods that became one. And it's actually something that people that study these things will tell you happens all the time. Maybe not all the time, but fairly frequently. Is you'll have two different stories, and they'll get mixed up, and then you'll have one story, and then if that story gets told more often than they did separately, then that it becomes one story. An example of that could possibly be Sharknado. We have shark movies like Jaws, and we have tornado movies like Twister. But I mean, and then we have this Sharknado thing. The Sharknado is obviously it's a combination. It's a syncretism. It's two ideas mixed into one. But it might be the case that 3,000 years from now, all we have is the Sharknado stories. We don't have shark stories or tornado stories. Or we might have sort of memories, and then we might try to figure out the question, well, were there actually sharks and actually tornadoes, or was there just Sharknado? I hope that's sufficiently ridiculous that you're both laughing and get the point. So we got aliens and giants in the story that they want to present to us, because it's the story that they presume everyone knows, and it's the Judeo-Christian culture, and we went over this before too. This is what they're going to say, but the reality is that there's lots of alien stories that don't have giants, and there's lots of giant stories that don't have aliens. So these are two different ideas. Now, all we have to do is look at statistics that exist today to get to the conclusion that the variation in human height is not uniform across cultures. So, if we go to somewhere like Korea, we see that people are generally short, especially women are very short. Whereas if you go to Sweden, then people are taller. Now, like I said, there's variation. Not everybody in Sweden is tall, and not everybody in Korea is short. But a statistical average is going to show that there are differences in average height. And that's after thousands of years of migration and large amounts of genetic drift floating around all over the place. If we go back several thousand years, where you had northerners specifically evolving with very little gene flow from people in the Middle East, or people from Africa, or people in the Indian subcontinent, we might have more dramatic human characteristics. Our variation might come out as more dominant in certain areas, and we might see larger differences between populations. Now, that only works because it's short-term. We don't need to get into that. We can say that there's more variation in Africa than there is outside of it. But that's because it's been there for so long. If we were to take a small group of people from Africa and put them on an island, we would see that would change. And we would have people would very quickly become the same, and then only change over a longer period of time. Right? So if we have a situation where being taller is an evolutionary advantage up in the north, and being shorter is an evolutionary advantage in warmer areas, then you end up with this difference, right? And you can very easily come to the conclusion that you may have, short people looking at tall people and saying you're a giant. Is there archaeological evidence for this? Well, I've seen some reports of early Indo-European cultures, like very early, as in like still in the Ukraine. The Sardinia stog culture is one example, where they found humans that are routinely over 7 feet tall. So they found mass graves, and lots of the people there are between 7 and 8 feet tall. That's a far cry from this video, which is trying to convince us that people were 12 feet tall, and that's a little bit outside of the realm of good sense. When somebody tries to tell you that there's mass graves of 12 feet tall people, you should probably be pretty skeptical. When somebody tries to tell you that there's mass graves of people that are 7.5 or 8 feet tall, well, then maybe you might want to ask for a little bit more evidence. And I'm not going to go for looking for it, but I'll tell you, it's Sredny Stog. It's some kind of Slavic language. I believe it's Sredny space Stog. There's a first and second level of these things. This is very early Indo-European culture. This is like in the Ukraine or the Caucasus or somewhere around there. And we can find this evidence. We can also find evidence that suggests that people a little bit further south than that were fairly short. So you end up with this kind of racial difference of shorter Semitic people and taller Indo-European type people. Now, something that this video seems to be a little bit confused about is the ethnic origin of Sumerians. Sumerians were probably white. In contrast, see, I should be careful here. Egyptians were probably black, and Sumerians were probably white. The whole Semitic thing were people that existed in the desert, or maybe somewhere halfway in between, may have even come from Africa. Um, and just they didn't. The Semites were late to civilization. So when you see really, really old, or when you're talking about really old, or later, anyways, when you talk about old, settlements in the Mesopotamian area, they were not Semitic. They were pre-Semitic. And what happened was the Semites came in from the deserts around Arabia. They conquered all of it, and they went from there. Most of these people in the area are clearly Semites. The ones that kind of stand out a little bit and kind of make you scratch your head a little bit are Jews, who may in some abstract way be Iranians. The whole sky god thing is a little bit outside of the realm of traditional Semitic religion, and et cetera, et cetera. They're genetically the same as Kurds. So, I mean, either Kurds or Semites or Jews or Iranians, and it seems to be more the other way around. Probably a very early Iranian movement in, but Iranian nonetheless. I'm rambling. What I'm getting to is that when you see stories that are very old, and I talk about giants, you have to understand that the people that wrote those stories were probably fairly short. So if you're 5'5", or if 5'5" is tall, to you and everybody around you and everything that you interpret and everything that you understand, then somebody who's 6 feet tall or 6.5 or even 7 feet tall is a giant to you. That, if these are presented, in racial and linguistic terms, then you see how these things start to develop. And because it seems to be that the tall people were the Indo-European people that had the sky gods, it's easy to see how those two different stories can get intertwined as well, even if they're not actually the same story. So that's my take on this. Were there giants in the past? I think that aliens are more likely than giants. But I think that how tall you are is relative to what it is that you see around you. And like I say, there is evidence of that as well. And Sardinia, particularly, what does this have to do with it? How does it relate to that particular area? Well, that would have been an area where we know that there was a very early contact from Phoenicians, people on the Lebanese coast. They call them Canaanites here, which is ahistorical, to say the least. It's the biblical term, along with Nephilim. So I mean, and like I say, all of these documentaries do this. And at the end, it's always clear that the purpose of the documentary is to uphold a biblical narrative, right? And what they're really trying to do is they're trying to prove that what's in the Bible is true. In this particular case, you probably want to look outside of that, and look at some of the other, myths and stories that are around. Sardinia is an area where people from the north met people from the south, and it makes sense that the stories would be met there, right? So you had Indo-European peoples, or pre-Indo-European peoples. I'm going to use the term Nordic, although that's difficult. There were a people in Europe before the Indo-Europeans. They were the people that built the megalithic structures. That's actually an error that this video makes. It seems to want to tie the megalithic structures to Indo-European peoples, which would be false. The megalithic structures were there first, and those people may have also been quite tall. So, Sardinia may have been a place where some of them kind of held out a little bit. It makes sense that the stories would come from there, or that the stories would last there, because it's a meeting place of north and south, right? Another place where you might expect that to hold up would maybe be in the Caucasus. Although there's been so much stuff there over such a long period. Spain, uh, maybe the Alps around Italy, just places where different racial types would meet, and it would be remarkable to try to find some old documents from the area around the Netherlands to figure out how that worked out. But nonetheless, that's it's reasonable to expect that that's where it would end up, um, without having to jump into any really kind of crazy conclusions. Like I say, if you're 5'5", um, well, here's an empirical test. Um, why don't we send a group of Vikings, and let's make sure that we pick a bunch out that are tall, um, and we send them to Central Africa to interact with some pygmies who are like 4'10". Let's see how they react. You think that they're not going to notice that these people that are coming through here are twice their size? Of course they are. Well, or at least 30% bigger anyways. Like, you think that's not going to cross their mind? They're not going to notice that? Of course they are, right? So, we don't really need to come to crazy conclusions here. We just need to recognize that size is relative, and if you're short, then it's easy to call a tall person a giant. There's the rationalistic, naturalistic explanation that can explain the prevalence of certain stories that existed in the past, and that's how you come to deal with these sorts of things. So if we have stories of aliens and they're across the cultures, or people from the skies and they're across cultures, then how do you come up with a rational way to explain that? Certainly we don't talk about gods, right? And when we talk about giants, we might immediately think 12 feet, but maybe 7.5 is more reasonable. And thus when we talk about from the skies, maybe we might not talk about gods. Maybe we might just want to talk about, life forms from a different place, right? So you see how that's the naturalistic way to do it? It's the way to. It's not, grasping onto something supernatural. It's neutralizing it, and eliminating it, right? Anyways, I'm rambling, so I'm done with this. But giants in the past. Probably, but not what you mean, or not what you think when you hear the word giant.